The fluorescent lights in the break room of Mercy General Hospital hummed the way they always did at 4 a.m., and Rebecca Tran sat alone at the chipped plastic table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, staring at the email she'd already written but couldn't send. 9 years. 9 years of double shifts, of holidays spent wiping fevered brows that weren't her son's, of clocking in while another nurse clocked out and neither of them said more than 2 words because there was never time. The cursor blinked at the end of a sentence she'd rewritten 4 times. Please accept this letter as my formal resignation. Outside the window, the parking lot lay slick and black under the sodium lamps, and somewhere across town her 7-year-old boy was sleeping in a stranger's house because the overnight sitter had quit, and the only person left who'd take him after midnight was a neighbor she barely trusted. She thought about Caleb's face the night before. He hadn't cried. That was the thing that kept circling back to her, the thing that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. He'd looked up at her from the bottom bunk, his hair stuck to his forehead from the low fever that wouldn't quite break, and he'd asked her in this small, even voice, "Are you working again tonight?" And when she said yes, baby, just one more night, he'd nodded like a person twice his age and rolled over to face the wall. No tears, no tantrum, just acceptance. As if he'd already done the math on his mother a long time ago and come up short, and had decided to stop expecting more so it would stop hurting. Rebecca had stood in his doorway for almost an hour after that, watching him breathe, heating herself in a way that had no bottom. She was 36 years old. She'd been a single mother since Caleb was 11 months old, since the morning his father packed a duffel bag and left a note on the counter that said he wasn't built for this, like fatherhood was a piece of furniture that came with instructions he'd misplaced. She put herself through nursing school on grants and grit, working the desk at a tire shop during the day and studying pharmacology at the kitchen table at night with a baby monitor crackling beside her textbook. People told her she was strong. People always told single mothers they were strong, and Rebecca had come to understand that it was the thing you said to someone when you had no intention of helping them, a compliment shaped like a closed door. The hospital had promised flexibility when they hired her onto the cardiac unit. They talked about work-life balance in the orientation packet, printed on glossy paper next to a stock photo of a woman laughing with her children in a field. But the field never showed up. What showed up was the charge nurse calling her cell at 9 p.m. asking if she could cover, because they were short, because they were always short, and Rebecca said yes every single time because the overtime was the only reason the rent got paid and Caleb's inhaler stayed filled. She said yes until yes became the entire shape of her life, until her son learned to fall asleep to the sound of her keys leaving rather than coming home. Her supervisor, a brittle woman named Diane who managed the nursing floor the way a prison warden manages a yard, had pulled her aside 2 days earlier. Rebecca had just asked, whether there was any way to move to a permanent day shift so she could be home in the evenings while Caleb was sick. Diane had looked at her over the rim of her glasses and said that everyone wanted days, that seniority was seniority, and that if Rebecca couldn't handle the demands of the unit there were plenty of new graduates who could. "This is the job," Diane had said, sliding a stack of charts across the desk. "Nobody's keeping you here." And the awful thing was that Diane was right. Nobody was keeping her. That was exactly the problem. Nobody anywhere was keeping Rebecca and Caleb except Rebecca, and she was running out of herself to give. So at 4 a.m. in the humming break room, with her coffee going cold and her son asleep in a house that wasn't his, Rebecca Tran did the most frightening thing she had ever done. She pressed send. The email vanished off the screen, taking 9 years with it, and for a long moment she just sat there with her hands flat on the table waiting to feel the panic. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, frightening lightness, the kind a person feels when they finally let go of a rope they've been clutching over a drop, only to discover the ground was closer than they thought. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was no ground at all. She didn't know yet, but she knew she couldn't keep being a mother who only existed as a sound her son heard through a wall. She finished out the shift in a daze. When morning came and the day nurses filed in with their travel mugs and their complaints about traffic, Rebecca gathered the few things she kept in her locker: a spare cardigan, a photo of Caleb at the county fair holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, a granola bar she'd been saving for a hunger that never came on a shift this long. She put them in her bag. Diane found her in the hallway and said only, "I got your email." Rebecca waited for more. There wasn't any. Diane walked past her toward the nurses' station like Rebecca had already become a gap in the schedule, a problem for someone else to solve. The other nurses didn't say much either. A couple of them squeezed her arm. One of them, a younger girl named Priya, whispered, "Good for you," with her eyes wide like Rebecca had done something both brave and insane, which was about right. She drove across town in the gray morning light to pick up Caleb from the neighbor's house. He came to the door in yesterday's clothes, his backpack already on, and when he saw it was her his whole face opened up. "You came," he said, surprised, and that single surprise word nearly put her on her knees right there on the porch. He'd expected the neighbor to walk him to the bus. He'd expected, as he always did, to handle it himself. Rebecca knelt down and pulled him into her so hard he laughed and said she was squishing him, and she said good, that's the point, and she carried his backpack to the car even though he was 7 and perfectly capable of carrying it himself, because for once she wanted to be the one who carried things for him. That morning she kept him home from school. She knew it was probably the wrong call, that a responsible parent would have sent him in, but she'd just blown up her entire career and she wanted one ordinary day with her boy before the consequences arrived. They made pancakes from a box, the kind where you only add water, and Caleb insisted on flipping them himself and got batter on the ceiling somehow, and they laughed about it. They watched cartoons under a blanket. His fever had finally broken in the night and he was himself again, loud and silly and full of questions, and Rebecca soaked up every minute of it the way you'd drink water in a desert, knowing it wouldn't last. It didn't last. The first letter came 3 days later, a notice from the property management company. Rent was due in 11 days and there was a past due balance from the previous month she'd been juggling, and the letter used the word eviction in bold print like a slap. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table and did the math she'd been afraid to do. Her last paycheck would cover this month if she didn't eat, didn't drive, didn't breathe. After that there was nothing. She had $400 in savings, a number so small it almost felt like a joke, and a credit card she'd maxed out on Caleb's specialist visits months ago. The cardiac condition he'd been born with, a small hole that the doctors monitored and managed with medication and quarterly checkups, was stable for now, but stable cost money. The medication cost money. The medication cost money. The cardiologist 3 towns over who actually knew Caleb's history cost money. Everything that kept her son's heart beating in its careful rhythm had a price tag and Rebecca had just walked away from the only thing that paid it. She applied for jobs the way a drowning person grabs at water. She sent her resume to every clinic, every urgent care, every doctor's office within 40 miles. The responses, when they came at all, were the same. The positions were nights, the positions were weekends, the positions required exactly the kind of round-the-clock availability she'd left her last job to escape. One office manager actually said it out loud during a phone interview. "We need someone without a lot of outside obligations," and Rebecca understood that her son was an outside obligation, that being a mother made her less hireable, that the system was built for people who had a wife at home and she was the wife and there was no one behind her. The weeks ground on. She sold her grandmother's ring, the only thing of value she owned, to a pawn shop run by a tired man who gave her less than it was worth and didn't pretend otherwise. She canceled the internet and started taking Caleb to the public library so he could do his reading homework on their computers. She learned which grocery store marked down its bread on Tuesday nights and which food pantry didn't ask too many questions. She stopped eating lunch so the math would work, and she got good at making it look like a choice, telling Caleb she'd already eaten, that she wasn't hungry, that she'd grab something later. He was 7. He believed her. That was its own kind of heartbreak, that he still believed her, that he hadn't yet learned to read the particular way a mother lies to protect her child from the truth of how thin the rope had gotten. And still she smiled. Every time Caleb laughed at something, every time he came running to show her a bug he'd found or a tower he'd built, she smiled like the world was fine, because she'd decided early on that whatever else she failed to give him, she would not give him fear. She would carry that herself. She would carry all of it herself, the way she'd carried everything since the morning his father walked out, and if her arms were shaking nobody had to know but her. The evening it all came to a head. She was helping Caleb with his spelling words at the kitchen table when the refrigerator stopped humming. Just like that, the steady mechanical drone she'd heard her whole adult life without ever noticing it simply stopped, and the kitchen went dark, and the little nightlight in the hallway blinked out. The power company had finally done it. She'd called them twice, begged for an extension, been transferred to a department that put her on hold until the office closed. Now the apartment sat in a darkness so total that Caleb's pencil stopped scratching against the paper and he looked up at where her face should be and said, quietly, "Mom." And Rebecca, who had not cried through any of it, who had held it together through the resignation and the eviction notice in the pawn shop and the empty cupboards, felt something crack right down the center of her. Not in front of him. She would not break in front of him. She would not break in front of him. She fumbled in the drawer for the candles she kept for power outages and her hands were shaking so badly she dropped the matches twice before one caught. The small flame threw her son's face into gold and shadow, and he was watching her with those steady eyes that had stopped expecting things, and she opened her mouth to tell him it was an adventure, that they were camping, that everything was fine. Someone knocked on the door. Rebecca froze with the match still burning down toward her fingers. She blew it out. Her first thought was the landlord, come to nail the eviction notice to the door in person, and her stomach turned over. She told Caleb to stay at the table. She crossed the dark living room and opened the door a few inches. Standing in the dim hallway light was a woman Rebecca had seen exactly once before, in a glossy photo on the wall of the hospital's main lobby, beneath a plaque about the foundation that funded the cardiac wing. Eleanor Whitfield. The hospital's chief executive, the woman whose name was on the building, on the letterhead, on the donor walls, a name spoken in the break room with a particular hush reserved for people who decide whether you keep your job without ever knowing your face. She was older than her photo, somewhere in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back and a long charcoal coat dark with rain across the shoulders. And beside her, half hidden against her leg, stood a small girl, maybe 6, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit and staring up at Rebecca with shy curiosity. For a moment neither woman spoke. Rebecca was acutely, painfully aware of the dark apartment behind her, the dead refrigerator, the candle smoke still hanging in the air, the visible evidence of a life coming apart at the seams. Eleanor Whitfield was the last person on earth she wanted to witness this. She found her voice and it came out thin. You came all this way. Eleanor's eyes moved past her, into the apartment, to where Caleb sat at the kitchen table in the candlelight with his spelling words in front of him. Something in the older woman's face changed, some composure she'd carried up the stairs slipping for just a second before she caught it. I'm sorry to come unannounced, Eleanor said. Her voice was lower and rougher than Rebecca expected, not the polished thing from the foundation videos. I've been trying to find you for 2 weeks. The HR department wouldn't give me your address. I had to ask 3 people who shouldn't have told me. She paused. May I come in? I won't stay long. There's something I need to tell you, and I'd rather not say it in a hallway. Rebecca didn't know what else to do. She stepped back and let them in, fumbling to light another candle, apologizing for the dark in a voice that sounded like someone else's. Eleanor waved off the apology and stood in the small living room taking it all in. The threadbare couch, the bills fanned across the counter, the careful drawings Caleb had taped to the walls because they couldn't afford to frame anything. The little girl with the rabbit drifted toward Caleb, drawn by the candlelight and the cartoons frozen on the dead television, and Caleb, who was always kind to anyone smaller than himself, slid one of his spelling pages toward her and offered her a crayon. The 2 children settled onto the floor as if they'd always known each other. Eleanor watched them for a long moment. When she turned back to Rebecca, there was something working behind her eyes that the woman in the foundation photos had never been allowed to show. I read your resignation email, she said. All of them crossed my desk eventually, the ones from the floor, especially the ones who've been with us a long time. Yours had a sentence in it. She recited it from memory slowly. I became a nurse to care for people, and I'm leaving because I can no longer care for the one person who's mine. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I read that sentence about 40 times. Rebecca didn't remember writing it. She'd written that email at 4 in the morning, half out of her mind with exhaustion, and the words had come from some place below thought. I want to tell you something, Eleanor said, and I'd ask you to let me finish before you decide what kind of person I am. She glanced at the little girl on the floor, then back. That's my granddaughter Maddie. I'm raising her. My daughter Maddie's mother, she died 11 months ago. Overdose. Pills, then the harder thing, the way it usually goes. She said it flatly, the way people say things they've had to say too many times to soften anymore. And I have spent the last 11 months realizing that I had no idea who my own daughter was. I built that hospital. I built 3 of them. I sat on boards and shook hands at galas, and I told myself I was doing something that mattered, and the whole time my own child was drowning 10 miles away and I didn't see it, because I was never home long enough to look. Her voice caught, just slightly, and she pressed on through it. She used to ask me, when she was small, the same age your boy is now, she used to ask me if work was more important than her. And I'd tell her, don't be silly, of course not, and then I'd get in the car and go to work. Every time, I taught her she came second by showing her, 1,000 times, that she did. The candle guttered. Caleb and Maddie were murmuring to each other on the floor, oblivious, building something out of crayons and spelling words. When I read your email, Eleanor went on, you'd done the thing I never had the courage to do. You looked at your child and you chose him over the paycheck, over the security, over everyone telling you that you were throwing your life away. You chose him while there was still time to choose. And I sat in my office and I thought, my God, this woman is going to lose everything for doing the one thing I should have done 30 years ago. She drew a slow breath. I couldn't let that be the end of the story. I couldn't fix mine. But I'll be damned if I was going to sit in a building with my name on it and watch yours fall apart for the exact same reason. She reached into the leather bag on her shoulder and set a folder on the kitchen table next to the candle. Rebecca opened it with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking. She'd braced herself for charity, for a check, for the kind of one-time gesture that lets a wealthy person feel better and changes nothing by morning. It wasn't that. Inside was a proposal, typed and formal, for a position that didn't exist yet, a role Eleanor was creating, a family care coordinator for the hospital network, someone with clinical experience who would build and run a program for the staff themselves, on-site childcare, guaranteed predictable schedules for parents of young children, paid leave when a nurse's own kid got sick. Daytime hours, full benefits. Coverage, the document specified in plain language, for dependents with chronic conditions, no exclusions. There was a salary figure on the second page that made Rebecca's vision blur. And clipped to the front, in handwriting that pressed hard enough to dent the paper, was a note. No one who spends their life caring for strangers should have to choose between that work and their own child. Help me build a place where they don't. Rebecca looked up. The candlelight swam. I don't want you to take this because you're desperate, Eleanor said quietly. I want you to take it because you already know exactly what's broken about how we do this. You lived it. You're the only person I've met in 20 years who I'm certain would build it right. She glanced at the two children on the floor, at Caleb showing Maddie how to draw a dog, and her composure finally gave way entirely, her eyes filling without shame. You did the brave thing first. Let me do the next one. For a long time Rebecca couldn't speak. She thought about all the nights she'd left her keys clicking in the lock while her son lay awake. She thought about the sentence she'd written at 4 in the morning, the truest thing she'd ever put into words, and how it had traveled up through a building full of people who never noticed her and landed on the one desk where it mattered. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how strange it was that the thing that saved her was the very decision everyone swore would destroy her. Across the room, the refrigerator shuddered and hummed back to life. The hallway nightlight flickered on. Somewhere a meter had been read, a payment posted, a small mercy arranged before Eleanor ever knocked, though Rebecca wouldn't learn about that part until later, and when she did, she would cry in the shower where Caleb couldn't hear. Okay, she said finally. It was all she could manage. Okay, yes. Eleanor nodded once the way people do when something heavy has finally been set down. The two children looked up at the sudden return of the lights and Caleb said, Mom, the TV works again, with the uncomplicated joy of a 7-year-old, and Rebecca laughed through her tears and said, yes, baby, it does, everything works again, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she almost believed it. She walked Eleanor and Maddie to the door a while later. The rain had softened to a drizzle. At the threshold Eleanor turned and looked at her, two women who'd arrived at the same terrible crossroads 30 years apart and chosen opposite roads, finally standing on the same side of it. Be there for him, Eleanor said, all of it, the boring parts especially, the homework and the spelling words and the nights nothing happens. That's the part I'd give anything to have back. She managed a small broken smile. It goes faster than anyone tells you. Then she took her granddaughter's hand and walked down the stairs into the rain, and Rebecca stood in the doorway of her lit-up apartment with her son calling her name from the couch, and she understood, finally, that the bravest thing a person can do is not to keep holding on. Sometimes it's to let go of the thing that's killing you slowly and trust that you matter enough to land somewhere soft. She'd let go in a humming break room at 4 in the morning, certain she was falling. She'd been wrong about the falling. She closed the door and she went to sit beside her boy in the warm light, and she stayed. I keep coming back to that sentence Rebecca wrote at 4 in the morning, the one about no longer being able to care for the one person who was hers. She didn't write it to be brave. She wrote it because she was empty, and sometimes the truest thing a person ever says comes out when there's nothing left to dress it up with. And here is what I've learned from watching her, from sitting with this story longer than I expected to. Nothing that happened to her was an accident. She pressed send, and that one honest act set everything else in motion. The right person read it. The door opened. Cause and effect, the way it always works, even when we can't see the line connecting one thing to the next. What saved Rebecca wasn't luck, not really. It was that she'd already done the hard part herself. She'd spent 9 years learning her craft, holding a household together with shaking hands, refusing to let her son taste the fear she carried. By the time Eleanor knocked on that dark apartment door, Rebecca had already become someone worth betting on. The opportunity didn't create her character, it found it. That's the part I want anyone watching to sit with, because we tend to wait for the knock before we become the person worth knocking for, and it works the other way around. I think about the 3 things that carried her, and I think they're the same 3 that carry all of us when life gets thin. The first is doing right by the people who depend on you even when no one is watching and no one is clapping. The way Rebecca skipped her own lunches so Caleb could eat and called it a choice. The second is the clear-eyed kind of thinking that lets you see a trap for what it is, the way she finally understood that saying yes to every shift was slowly erasing her instead of saving her. And the third is the plain stubborn strength to keep getting up, to sell the ring, to walk to the library, to light the candle with trembling fingers and still smile at your kid. You need all three. Goodness without strength gets crushed. Strength without wisdom burns itself out. Wisdom without the will to act is just regret with a vocabulary. Eleanor had the strength once and lost the chance to use it on her own daughter. That's the quiet warning underneath this whole thing. She wasn't a villain. She was just late. And she spent the rest of her life trying to give someone else the time she never gave the person she loved most. So if you take anything from Rebecca and Caleb tonight, let it be this. Don't wait to be rescued before you decide you're worth rescuing. Build the character now, in the dark, in the boring nights when nothing happens. The knock comes for people who were already ready, and the bravest thing you'll ever do won't look brave at all. It'll look like letting go.